All right, so it's time for our final installment on the Platonism versus paganism uh, debate that happened on pagan revivalism. We've been doing commentary on it. You can find the playlist to it here. So if you want to watch the rest of it, feel free to go and watch through all of it. I'll be referencing back to the other videos that we've done. Today, we're really just going over the closing statements and wrapping the whole thing up. You know, we've got one last kind of closing statement, and a big part of that is going to be talking about the dialogue of the Euthyphro. So a good chunk of this is going to be us kind of reviewing Euthyphro, but there's a few other things in there that we want to touch on. So let's just jump right into it.
Well, I appreciate it. And so I'm going to go through closing arguments, and then after that, we'll open up to our guests. So I got a couple of notes here from what you said, which is Platonism should not be taken literally. Well, if it can't be taken literally, or its claims not taken seriously, then why even posit it or believe in it at all? If it's Platonism, but you can make your own Platonism and rules don't apply and Plato's words don't necessarily apply because they've been proven wrong, well, then that just shows the weakness of Platonism, quite frankly.
Yeah, so he starts off with this critique that S had said, you know, we don't need to necessarily take all the things in the Platonic dialogues as being literally true. And that's kind of obvious. You know, when we're reading the Republic or we're reading any of the Platonic myths, we know that they're myths, and Plato describes them as myths, you know, in the sense of saying they're allegories to try to illustrate a greater point. And the point was never to take them literally and go, oh, this is literally what's some history that happened. And this sort of aversion to allegory is one of the craziest things in the position of a lot of these sort of Nietzschean pagans, is like that every single thing that was ever written has to be some quasi historical perspective, that, you know, people don't speak poetically or they don't use language in this way to try to point towards something else. And that's really the way that we see myth altogether. Is myth is not the truth itself in the words itself. It's something that points towards something else. That's what we really see them as symbols. I don't really like the word allegory either, because, you know, allegory typically implies that there's a one-to-one meaning with something. And the reality is there isn't a one-to-one meaning with any of the myths. You're not going to be able to say, well, that's just an allegory for this doing this. It's not that simple. You know, they're really more like symbols in that they have a symbolic nature to them. So when you look at them, there's many different things that could apply to the story. So you can look at a particular myth and find these sort of applicable symbols that are eternal and show you a truth. But it's like a finger pointing towards the moon. It's not the moon itself. And this is a continual mistake that tons of different religions make, is to think that the words that they have on the page, that's the be all end all, the words themselves. And you end up with this kind of book worshiping and poetry worshiping, when Platonism is always driving after the truth. We don't care about the words themselves. It's about the truth that they are trying to express. The truth is what we want to get to. We want to understand the truth better. And the words just help us get there. The words guide the way and show us, hey, look over here towards this, and you might see some of the truth if you look in that direction. That's why we care about it. We don't care about it for its own sake, or, you know, need these myths to be a literal history book for us. And in fact, we kind of lose some of the meaning there if we do treat them as just history.
And, you know, you said yourself, it shouldn't be taken literally, but you can also phrase it as you shouldn't take it seriously, because you can create your own Platonism, which shows that it's not as sound of a philosophy as it is propagandized to be.
Yeah, this idea that you can create your own Platonism is just bogus. You can't create your own Platonism. And I think he's trying to point to the fact that there are many different Platonists out there with differing theories on things. You know, the way the Plotinus sees things is different than Iamblichus, is different than the Middle Platonists or Proclus or Damascus. And he takes this to mean, well, you can just invent your own Platonism. It's build your own adventure. And that's not the case at all. It's a lot more like science. You know, just because there's multiple scientific theories, just because Newton and his physics doesn't necessarily agree with Einstein, which doesn't necessarily agree with later quantum physicists, that doesn't mean that science is just a make it up as you go way of looking at the world. It's not just contrived by each and individual person from nothing, right? And this is the problem when you let go of the concept of truth and you're looking for truth in arbitrary things like poems, and you think that that's the source of truth itself, or you're trying to say that also no ultimate truth exists. Truth is just whatever the tribal master or chieftain says, right? If that's how loose and relative your understanding of truth is, it's going to be hard for you to understand how a group of people could be theorizing about the same thing and come up with different answers, but then not actually be opposed to one another. Right? In science, they're all moving towards the truth because they're observing reality empirically and they're making observations and then they're making theories based off of what they see and saying, okay, I think it's like this. I think it's like that. Right? And they can have differing theories, but they're all moving in the same direction and they all assume some basic fundamental truths that have been discovered, tried, and tested. Platonism is the exact same way. You know, Plato kicks off this tradition where we have a history of understanding the core tenets of our philosophy and the way that the cosmos works and the way that basically reality comes into being. And we all agree on those things. But the particulars, people continue to ask questions, and they ask questions about particular things that Plato didn't necessarily cover. And so the theory expands from there. And there are varying different opinions on the finer points. But over time, we tend to coalesce over certain ideas. You know, by the time we get to Plotinus, we get, you know, the formalization of the idea of the one. We get it in Parmenides at first, but Plotinus is really the one who fleshes out that theory of the one in more detail. And that basically became a part of the Platonic orthodoxy after him, right? And same thing even with the Middle Platonists. The Middle Platonists organized the core tenets of the thought, you know, things like the nous, the soul, the sensible universe, the structure of the cosmos, the demiurge. All of those things got really substantially put into the sort of, quote, orthodoxy of Platonism in Middle Platonism. And so this orthodoxy that I'm talking about too is not something that was, you know, put together by some council of Platonists or something in the 2nd century. It's just something that emerges naturally, just the same way that science doesn't need to have a council of scientists that come together and claim the standard model of the universe. It's just something that emerges when enough people are working on trying to understand the truth and they understand the methods for understanding the truth. They come to general consensus on things. And that's what Platonism is. There's a general consensus of how things work. And then there's areas on the fringe where we're still experimenting. We're still trying to understand. And this is a strength of Platonism. This is one of our greatest strengths, actually, is that we're not a rigid orthodoxy. It's not like things were just put into place and they can never be questioned. All of it can be questioned, but there are things that we generally consider to be kind of settled. And, you know, if you're going to battle against the tripartite structure of the universe, the new soul sensible tripartite cosmos, you better have a pretty good reason for that. But we'll listen to it and we'd be curious about it because at the end of the day, most Platonists I know care more about the truth than they do about Platonism itself, right? Platonism is just the thing that they see as getting as close to the truth as possible. But the truth is what really matters, not this ideology or this philosophy or that philosophy.
And you brought up the axial age stuff, which is a real phenomenon that spread around the ancient world to criticize and overthrow traditional religion. This goes.
I'm going to have to do a whole video on this axial age theory. It's something I've seen put out there in a bunch of different videos talking about how Platonism and every other axial age religion like Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Vedanta philosophy, all of them, that they all were this like massive movement to try to destroy traditional religion. And it helps understand these guys' worldview a lot. And so throughout the process of making these videos, I've looked up a bunch on this sort of axial age theory and their view of paganism being exclusively pre-axial religion, whatever that means, you know? And so I think I need a longer video on that. But what I'll say here now is his view that the axial religions, like Platonism, you could say, were explicitly trying to destroy traditional religion is false. They're an outgrowth of that pre-axial belief system. And that pre-axial belief system doesn't have things like theology and philosophy the way that Platonism does, but you do see the early moments of it. You see sort of proto-theology and proto-philosophy in the mythology and the other ideas that they're talking about. It just hadn't really fully formed into what it was later under Plato and Socrates. I think it's all there, and you can see a more of a natural progression, but it behooves them to try to draw this huge wedge and make it seem like it was this like catastrophic revolution. But I don't think the evidence supports that at all.
Back to my opening statement. And one of the ones in particular that you responded to was, you are not your body, right? That your body is separate from what you truly are. And I would posit that not only is this physically false, because you can change the essence of your being by probing your brain in certain areas, or by eating certain foods, or by having a deficiency in your diet, right? You can change your being. You could change your attitudes. If you, like, everyone's heard of the old adage, woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, right? Or you didn't have your coffee, so you're more agitated than usual. That sometimes, yes, that other things can influence your being. And this is just lived reality to all of us, but most of us don't really think about it. So I would...
Yeah, I think this is such a silly kind of thing that, like, he's equating personality and temperament with the essence of who a person is. It actually shows a lot about the way that he probably looks at himself and the world. If you really think that what you are at your utmost core is your personality and your temperament, then I could see how threatening something like Platonism probably looks to you, because it's pointing you towards some deeper aspect of who you are that you don't really want to look at, because that's terrifying, because it does go beyond your ego, right? And he's basically saying, no, I am my ego. The egoic self that I think I am, you know, this sort of persona of my personality, that is the core of who I am. And I really noticed that at the core of a lot of these different people that criticize Platonism is that there is this like grasping of the ego that happens, where they're just desperately trying to hold on to their sense of self and don't want to lose their sense of self, which is really little more than their personality in their opinion. But it should be encouraging in that what we're saying is like, hey, you're more than just your personality, that your personality is going to change. Your temperament's going to change from day to day. Your personality is going to change throughout your life. And even when you're reincarnated, your personality is probably going to be different in your next life. It may be vastly different than what it is right now. And that's okay, because the core of you is something more than that. But on another level, something that's going to become really confusing about the way these guys view the world is, at one moment they're saying you are your body, and yet at the same time they're not denying that there is a spiritual realm of some kind. So let's just let him dig his own hole, because you're going to see how incoherent this is.
Consider people re-examining the idea that you are not your body, because you are your body. And to explain the importance of this, because this is very important. If you take anything away from this debate, take this away.
Okay, before he jumps into this, this is going to show really what this is all about. and I want you to pay attention closely to what he says, because this is the core of this thought process. These, the Nietzschean pagans, the pre-axial pagan type of ideas, all of this boils down to what he's about to say as the most important thing. But I want to add one more thing. If you're curious about the idea about like you are your body, you're not your body, he tries to make this a one-to-one correlation that like, hey, if you poke your brain, you can change your temperament. That means that you are your brain. There's a lot of great books out there. I've been reading this one, Irreducible Mind by Edward Kelly. Awesome book. If you're looking for some kind of Platonist books that are scientific, I mean, he's not really a Platonist, but this is sort of a scientific understanding that the mind is the irreducible substrate of the universe, not material. And in here, he points out a lot of great things that directly refute the kind of things that the pagan revivalist guy is talking about, that you can find correlations between the brain and the mind, but there are also a lot of things that don't line up at all, right? When you look at things like, psi phenomenons, like out-of-body experiences, things like that, but even simple things like memory gets really hard to explain if the brain is literally what you are, that you're just like this brain jar in a skull, right? Things like that don't really make sense. Plenty of other things. It's a great book. I don't want to go into it. We'll probably do a book review on it at some point. But if you're looking for more against that kind of frame of mind that he has, it's a great book.
That when you separate yourself from your body, you disassociate who you are as a person from your true self. When you unite these two, this is why ancient pagan religions viewed family, lineage, ancestry, folk, tribe, race as not just happenstance, but as integral parts of your being. It's what makes you, you.
Yeah, we're not actually disagreeing with this. And the idea that Plato treats, or Platonism in general, treats your material being, and the things that are related to your family, to your tribe, to your nation, to your race, all of that all of that is just happenstance and arbitrary, is not true. And this is this sort of sleight of hand they do, where they say, well, if you're not literally your body, in the sense that like your body is the essence and core of who you are, if that's not the center of who you are, then that means that it doesn't matter at all, that it's just happenstance, it's just random. And that's not the case at all. Like, all of these things are expressions of your true being. And so all we're saying is like, hey, we're saying that the body is not you in the direct sense. It's not the core. It's like a reflection of you, right? And so a reflection is still coming from that same light source, right? You have a light source, it gets reflected and bounces off and goes somewhere else. That's what we're saying the body is, right? We're saying it's a reflection, but it's a reflection of something true, right? It's a reflection of your true self, and it's important for that reason. And we care about the differences. And Platonism, again, he keeps trying to kind of hurl this monistic philosophy on us, and it's like, no, like diversity is a part of the full flowering of being, and all of these things that make you who you are important and shouldn't be disregarded. When we're here in the material world, they need to be respected and they should be preserved and protected. Those are all good things. So we're not saying that it doesn't matter or that it's happenstance, not at all.
And it's what gives one purpose and drive and all of these other things. So in other words, when you separate your true being from your body and just view it as happenstance, then family doesn't necessarily matter. Ancestry, lineage doesn't matter. Caste doesn't matter. Race, tribe, ethnicity, all of these things don't matter because it's just happenstance. You just happened to be who you are. Whereas paganism says, no, you are your ethnos. You are your ancestors reborn. And that gives you purpose, drive. That gives you meaning. More.
I mean, I certainly think that gives this guy meaning, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't give meaning to Platonists. I think it's just in a hierarchy of values for us, where, family, tribe, community, nation, all of these things are important aspects of our identity. What we're saying is that if you just keep going up in that chain, there are even more important things. We're a part of a chain of gods, right? And these gods are what give us aspects of our identity and aspects of our being too. And all of those gods ultimately lead up to the one God. And that gives our ultimate being, our ultimate identity, right? And so the big thing is we just don't think of these things as mutually exclusive. This is what the chain of being is, right? That you can trace it all back to an ultimate source, but when it comes all the way down, it's very particularized. And at no point are we saying that like we have to disregard one entirely or treat it as happenstance. Not at all. In fact, what we're looking to do is an integrated unity into these things so that we become part of the harmony of the cosmos. That's the most important part. It's not about dissolving yourself. It's not about forgetting that these distinctions exist. It's about coming into harmony with the cosmos, which you don't do by dissolving these differences. You do by honoring and celebrating them and having them in the proper order. That's what this is really about.
More than just separating it. That the physical reality and the spiritual reality intertwine and intersect with each other. They're not separate like the noose in the real world, where the noose is perfect and never changing, and this world sucks. It's full of change, and oh my goodness, I stubbed my toe, therefore the world is fake.
Yeah, again, is not at all what we're saying. That's a very Gnostic way of looking at the world. We don't look at it that way. And the noose isn't separated from the world. The noose is the most real thing there is. That's what we're saying. We're saying that's the basis of the rest of this, that they're intertwined in one another. We are saying that. And again, it's like, he went from basically treating us like monists in one moment, and now he's treating us like we're dualists, like we're saying there's this hard separation between these things, rather than seeing them as this integrated unity that they are, right? And I think this is the problem. It's like when you don't treat Platonism as being this sort of dual aspect unity, right? When you don't treat it that way and you keep trying to treat it as, some extreme form of monism or extreme form of dualism, you miss out on what it really is. You start losing track of it. And this happens all the time. People want to put us in one of those two buckets, and they then just miss what we're actually saying entirely. And we just end up with a bunch of straw mans. But going to the incoherent aspect of his argument here, he just said that the spirit and the body are integrated and unified together. I thought you were your body. So what's this spirit now that you're talking about, right? And he said you're reborn through your ancestors. Well, what's reborn? Is it your body? Does your body literally travel from one body to the next? Well, that doesn't make any sense, because they're two different bodies. You have one body in one life and another body in another life. So what is it that transfers from one body to the next? It's not your body. It's something else, right? So there's a period of time where you're not your body. You're something else. Whether you want to call that spirit, you want to call that soul, whatever you want to call that, there's a period of time in between your lives where you're not your body. You're something else, right? The thing that's traveling from one body to the next. So what is it? Are we our bodies or are we not? And this is where Platonism's ideas make more sense. We just have a better model of how this works, right? Because it makes perfect sense that you are really your soul. That's the thing that travels from body to body, right? Goes from one to the next. And each body is a reflection of that soul. And for that reason, all of the particular things about it are still important and still relevant because it's a material manifestation of your soul. And so you are still you, life to life to life, down your chain of ancestors. Sure, that's all still the case. But our thought about this is coherent and doesn't If you over-identify with the ephemeral thing that dies every 100 years or so, then you're missing out on this thing that doesn't die, the immortal thing, your immortal soul that travels from body to body. So that's really all we're saying.
And that kind of goes to consciousness as being. Platonism doesn't say all is one, but that is the crux of Platonic doctrine.
I'm glad he finally admits that that's not what we're saying, but then just says, but that is what you're saying. It's a perfect example of how this whole debate's gone. Platonism doesn't say that all is one. They're not monists, but that's exactly what they are.
Or metaphysic, right? You say Platonism doesn't have doctrine. But one of the things that Plotinus wrote in his Aeneids was doctrine. It was against the Gnostics, which were Middle Platonists.
He said this a couple times now. The Gnostics were not Middle Platonists. I don't know where he's getting this. This is a weird quirk he has.
And one of the things that Plotinus did in particular was he put the base of his metaphysic on the one. That without the one, you could not have the chain of being, you could not have Platonic doctrine. And he used Plato's Timaeus as well as other dialogues to prove this point.
Mostly Parmenides.
Problem is you are dealing with the fruit of the poisonous tree type of situation where we don't have to examine Plotinus because he's just doing commentary on Plato himself. So if you take out Plato, you take out Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, you take out Celestius, right? Because what these guys did was write commentaries on Platonic doctrine, Platonic dialogues.
I don't really get what his argument is here. I think it's kind of strange, but it might be kind of telling. Like he's saying, well, I don't have to contend with Plotinus. I don't have to contend with these other Platonists. I just have to knock Plato down and then I'm good. And it's like, not really. Like that's like being like, I don't have to take care of Einstein. I just have to knock down Newton. And then I can disprove all science. It's like, no, like they're still valid opinions with what these guys are saying, and their exposition on these ideas and their explanation of the Platonic dialogues is really valuable if you want to truly understand what the whole idea is. I wonder if at some level he's just trying to kind of hand wave away, like, hey, I don't have to argue with Plotinus, which I'm sure he doesn't want to argue with Plotinus, because if we went and just brought out Plotinus and started reading stuff from the Aeneids, it would basically destroy every single point that he has. It just shows that he doesn't really understand what Platonism is. So I don't know if that's what that's about. He's just trying to kind of protect himself from those commentaries. I don't really know.
And one of the ones, and I'm going to just skip to the end here, which is the Euthyphro Dilemma, which is something that we've been dancing around for a little while. But what is the Euthyphro Dilemma? The Euthyphro Dilemma is, are the gods good because they command it? Or do the gods love X and that's why it's good and holy? Or do the gods love X because it is good and holy? Now, this may seem like a confusing debate, but
I think that's a pretty good summation of what the Euthyphro Dilemma is about. We're going to go into exactly kind of the whole dialogue here, because the whole end of his argument is just about the Euthyphro Dilemma. But essentially, he's right. What they're talking about is, are things good because the gods love them, right? So the gods love something and that's what makes it good. Or do the gods love certain things because they are good in themselves? That's the question that the Euthyphro is asking.
It's really not, because what is holiness? What is goodness? Is goodness above the gods an abstract object that controls everything? Well, we've kind of went over this debate that there are some things that are not good. Therefore, there are things that are separate from the one. So all can't be one.
Right, which we've covered before, that's not what we're saying. So we can just put that to bed.
And this is the problem of evil,
which we've covered a whole video on. If you guys want to check, it's in the playlist.
but it applies to Platonism in a way that it doesn't apply to Abrahamic religions that blame it on the devil. They say that evil is good. So if somebody does something fucked up to you, that's good. Okay.
Not at all what we're saying.
You just don't appreciate it. You're just, stuck in your feelings. You're not thinking logically. But the Euthyphro dilemma is, are things holy because the gods will it? Or are things holy on their own and the gods recognize it as holy? Traditional religion says the former, that what is regarded as holy is what is loved by the gods. In other words, the gods are the arbiters of what is good and what is bad. Let's take the example of killing.
Okay. We'll let him get into this example in a second, but why don't we just introduce the dialogue a little bit and we go into what it's actually about. So let me give you a little bit of a background on Euthyphro. It's a pretty short dialogue, all in all. Like, of all the dialogues, you can read it in probably like 30 minutes. So I recommend you do. And it's so interesting that he would bring this Euthyphro dilemma up, because all you have to do is read the Euthyphro and you could see what he just said. He says the traditional religion believes that things things are good because the gods love them. All right. And the whole dialogue centers around that question and proves that it's totally ridiculous. And basically, like, his entire worldview is ridiculous. That he has this traditional pagan worldview about the gods. And I don't even think it's traditional. I think it's just wrong. So let's talk about where this dialogue starts. So Socrates is on his way to trial. And afterwards, this is the apology where he's been accused of corrupting the youth, right? So he's on his way to that trial and he comes across this guy, Euthyphro. And Euthyphro's outside the courts as well. And, Socrates starts up a conversation with him and finds out that Euthyphro's there for a court case as well. And he asks him about, well, what's this court case about? And Euthyphro says, well, my father, I'm accusing him of murder. And Socrates is shocked. This is a very anti-traditional type of thing, accusing your own father of murder. And Socrates is like, well, he must have done something really terrible for you to think that it's appropriate to accuse your father of murder. And what had happened is that Euthyphro's father, they had slaves or servants in their family. And one of the slaves got drunk and murdered another one of the slaves. And so Euthyphro's father took the murderer and bound him up and threw him in a ditch. And then he called to have a messenger go to the priest in town to tell him, hey, what should I do with this guy who just murdered one of my other servants? And while the messenger was out trying to get to the priest, he left the guy in the ditch and he basically died from exposure or hunger or thirst or something. Okay. So Euthyphro thinks that this is wrong, that it was murder what he did. His whole family disagrees with him. His mother, his sisters, all of them are like, what are you doing? Like, why are you defending this slave murderer? Like, why do you care? But Euthyphro is compelled by this sense of duty that he has to his belief in piety toward the gods. He says, it's pious for me to do what I'm doing. And the whole conversation strikes up because Socrates is about to go to trial for essentially impiety. And he goes, well, hey, if you know what piety is, I better learn from you before I go in there so that I know what piety is. And then I can just say, hey, the great and powerful Euthyphro taught me about piety. And I just learned all of this. So here's what piety is. And that's why I'm not guilty. Right. So it's kind of a fun little dialogue because, we all know what's about to happen. And we know this probably isn't going to go well, but we get a little peek into this sort of really warped view of what piety is. And Socrates, in his classic fashion, is just asking questions about this and trying to get to the truth of it. So let's see if we can find the beginning of this. I've got some highlights here in it. So Euthyphro really kicks it off, and this is in 4C, Euthyphro 4C, and he's talking about the murder, and Socrates is asking him, this must have been really crazy, that you would accuse your father of doing this, like for over a stranger. And Euthyphro says, it's ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think that it makes any difference whether the victim is a stranger or a relative. So just right off the bat, I think it's a little odd that the pagan revivalist guy is using Euthyphro as his example, because he's quite an anti-traditional figure, right? And he's doing something that's very unconventional and very not traditional within the society. But nonetheless, I guess he finds it useful because of what he says. So let's get to his definition here. And you know what? Actually, I'm going to jump back really quick because there's something else that he's mentioned, the pagan revivalist guys mentioned in this before about Euthyphro. And it's a couple lines about the gods and the myths. He mentioned this earlier where he said, basically, Socrates is asking Euthyphro about the gods, because Euthyphro's defense for accusing his father of murder is he looks to the gods. He says, well, if you read the myths, Zeus accuses his father of doing awful things, and he ends up castrating his own father and usurping him and all of this. And so if that's in the myths and that's what Zeus does, well, then I'm well within my rights to accuse my father of murder for what I think is right. And Socrates doesn't really find that very convincing. He says, indeed, Euthyphro, this is the reason why I am a defendant in the case, because I find it hard to accept things like that being said about the gods, and it's likely to be the reason why I shall be told I do wrong. Now, however, if you, who have full knowledge of such things, share their opinions, then we must agree with them too, it would seem. For what are we to say, we who agree that we ourselves have no knowledge of them? Tell me, by the god of friendship, that's Zeus, do you really believe these things are true? So this is the part that the pagan revivalist guy said is, do you really believe these things are true? So these stories about the gods doing things like castrating their fathers, he's like, do you really think that that's true? And that's something that actually happened? And Euthyphro responds, yes, Socrates. And so are even more surprising things of which the majority has no knowledge, right? And if you actually read the dialogue, what's really great is Euthyphro is a very vivid character, and he's kind of this like holier than thou, self-righteous kind of guy. He thinks he knows everything about the gods when he really doesn't know anything. And Socrates shows that he doesn't really understand what he's talking about. And so it is kind of funny, again, that the pagan revivalist guy's choosing Euthyphro as his champion here, because really he's kind of a pompous fool. That's really how he appears in the dialogue. And they kick it all off with this, because really central to this dialogue is this idea about myth. Are we going to take myths literally and believe that the gods really do these things? Because that's going to be important to how we understand piety moving on. So Socrates then asks Euthyphro, hey, why don't you just define piety for me? If you're doing this to your dad and you think this is pious, I got to go to court. Why don't you just give me the rundown? Like, what is piety? That way, hey, you're this respected figure about religion, supposedly. So you tell me, and then I'll probably get off on my charges because I'm going to use what you say. And Euthyphro says, well, then, what is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not is impious. So this is exactly what the pagan revivalist guy just said. He says that's what paganism is, this belief that what is dear to the gods or loved by the gods is pious, and what is not is impious. Okay. So there's some problems with this. So we take that first part about the myth, and what's the problem there? Well, Zeus's father, Cronus, he's a god. Zeus is a god. There's all these different gods, right? And in the myths, if we take those to be true, as both the pagan revivalist guy does, he says that we need to take them at face value for what they are. And Euthyphro too is saying, no, we just got to take those myths and poems at face value for what they are. Well, what happens in all the myths? The gods fight. They fight. They have wars. They have battles together, right? They're constantly quarreling. And Socrates makes this great point. He says, well, are they arguing about numbers? meaning like, hey, they have to count something up and they're arguing, no, I think it's 67 beads, or no, I think it's 65. Because they wouldn't argue about that, because they would just count them again and then they would come to the right answer. Or they wouldn't argue about something like, hey, what's the height of this object? Because they could just get a measuring stick and they'd go, okay, it's this tall. We don't have to argue about that. He says the things that they're probably arguing about are things like what is good and what is bad, what is right, what's wrong, what's just and what's unjust. Those are the things that people argue about in the real world, right? And Euthyphro agrees. And so they both agree, well, that's probably the kinds of things that they're arguing about, is things like that, things of this utmost importance of right and wrong. Well, if that's the case, Socrates says, then that means that the same things that are loved by the gods are also hated by the gods, because they disagree about these things, right? There isn't this unanimous agreement about what the good is amongst the gods. That's why they're fighting in the myths. And if that's the case, then how can what's pious be that which is loved by the gods, when that's not the same thing? It changes all the time, right? So he says this right here, and this is Euthyphro 7e. He says, then according to your argument, my good Euthyphro, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad. For they would not be at odds with one another unless they differed about these subjects, would they? And Euthyphro goes, yeah, you're right. So Socrates kind of wraps that up and says the same things then are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God loved and God hated. So that doesn't make any sense. Like right off the bat, if we're taking the worldview that this guy's trying to say is, hey, we got to take the myths literally, and the gods fight in the myths, then that means the things that are God loved are also God hated. So how can things that are pious be that which is loved by the gods? Because there is nothing that's consistently loved by the gods in that situation. So Euthyphro has to redefine what he means by this. And so the next thing he says is, well, I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite is what all the gods hate. That's what's impious, right? So he expands it out. So he realizes he can't just make this blanket statement and say, what the gods love is this, because that's not consistent. So he says maybe it's a consensus amongst the gods. The things that all the gods agree upon as being good, those things are what's good. And the things that all of the gods hate, those things are bad, right? So but Socrates asks another good question here, and digging into this kind of idea gets really to the core of the issue. And this is really like the Euthyphro Dilemma in a nutshell. He says, is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? So to really sum that up, what he's saying is, what is it about the gods loving something that makes it pious? Or do the gods love that thing because it is pious, right? And the problem, the dilemma, the real dilemma here is that if we're going to say that piety and good things essentially are good because the gods love them, then really what that means is that those things are arbitrary. They don't really matter. If it's just what the gods choose, they could choose anything. They could choose anything they want to be those things, or things that they all agree upon, you could say. And if that's what we're going to take as being the good, and especially if we're going to take it from the gods of myth literally, and not have a different, and I would say better conception of what those gods are, then their likes and dislikes are it. It's just their arbitrary decision of what is good and bad. And the gods could just as easily decide that murdering strangers is good, that's actually a good thing because the gods like it now, right? If they change their minds, or, if they decide one thing or another, then there it is. That's what goodness is. Whereas what Socrates is pointing to is that they like these things because they are pious. They like piety, right? that it's loved by the gods because it's pious, not because it's not pious because it's loved by the gods, right? That's the mistake that they're making here. So, so he goes on, and this is Socrates is talking more about this idea in 11b. You know, he says that the pious has the quality of being loved by all the gods, but you have not yet told me what the pious is. So they basically get to that point that I just said, where they go, look, it doesn't make sense that the gods just love something and that's what makes it pious, because then it's totally arbitrary. There's some quality about piety. And that's I think the most important thing, is that we as humans, even without the myths, can recognize something about piety. We don't have to just go look to a myth and go, well, what did the gods say about it? Right? Like, you can understand that good actions are good and just actions are just without having to reference poems constantly to figure it out, right? We have a natural sort of inborn morality that we can at least intuit some of these ideas. We might still have to think about it and make sure that we're, getting it right. But we do have an intuition about these things, because piety isn't something that's just arbitrarily decided by the gods. It's a thing. And the gods do love it, but they love it because it's pious, which means that piety is something else. Essentially, this argument that they're trying to make is a circular argument. It doesn't make sense, right? So how can the gods love something in particular if that thing itself doesn't exist and is just a reflection of their arbitrary decisions? That doesn't make any sense. It has to be something first in order for them to like it and love it. And so that's really what he's saying here. So Euthyphro has to change his thoughts again. Okay. So we get to that point and we're like, okay, so the pious is something different, right? It's something that the gods love for a particular reason. So maybe we can define piety a little bit better. And Euthyphro comes up with one more idea in 12e. He says that the godly and pious is the part of the just, the part of justice, that is concerned with the care of the gods, while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice. So he tries to relate it to justice and say piety is really a form of justice. And justice has these differing parts, right? There's the justice of men, but the justice of gods is the care of the gods. So what does Socrates do? He asks great questions. And so he's like, so it's kind of like, how a rancher cares for cattle, right? Or, a huntsman cares for dogs, right? And humans care for the gods. But then he asks, well, what exactly is it that we're giving to the gods? What do the gods get out of this whole thing? Is this like a transaction between us and the gods? And, it's obvious what the gods give to us, but what is it that we give to the gods in this transaction? Because the rancher gives things to cows and the huntsman gives things to dogs. So if it's our job to care for the gods, what care do we provide for them, right? And so Euthyphro kind of tries to put a finer point on this whole thing to explain himself. And he says, I say that if a man knows how to say and do what is pleasing to the gods at prayer and sacrifice, those are pious actions, such as preserve both private houses and public affairs of the state. The opposite of these pleasing actions are impious and overturn and destroy everything. So he's saying, well, hey, if you do the sacrifices correctly and you do the things that care for the gods, then that's pleasing to the gods. And if you don't do those things, then that's displeasing to the gods. And Socrates goes, well, that's the argument you started with, saying that the things that are pious are God loved and the things that are impious are God hated. That's the same place we started. And so he tries to get Euthyphro to explain himself again. He goes, yeah, that's not it, man. We just went around in a circle and we started back where we were before. And we already agreed that argument doesn't make any sense. And Euthyphro then says, well, we'll have to do this some other time, Socrates. I'm in a hurry now and it's time for me to go. And that's the end of the dialogue. Socrates just says a little bit after that and he goes, well, I guess I'm never going to know the answer to that question. And he's like, it's a shame because I'm about to go on trial. It'd be great if I knew what piety was. And it's just, a little tongue in cheek, I think. It's funny, but this is his whole argument. He's bringing up this Euthyphro dilemma, and it's like, I encourage anybody who's curious about this, go read Euthyphro. Read the whole thing. You can do it in 30 minutes, and you'll see that this entire worldview is completely bogus. And with a simple line of questioning, you can absolutely destroy it, and it just makes no sense whatsoever. So let's let him keep going.
Killing is a neutral act. It happens all the time. If you eat, you kill. Why? Because plants are alive, you eat them and kill them. Animals are alive, you eat them, you kill them and eat them, right? So killing is not bad per se, but it can be bad in certain circumstances. And those circumstances are dictated by the gods.
Okay. Hey, sorry for the sudden scene change. We had some audio problems, so I had to redo this. This part I don't really understand what he's getting at. It seems like his argument seems to be something along the lines of like moral relativism, like basically taking something that most people would say is bad. Not that killing is all bad, like he mentions, we have to kill plants to eat. We have to kill something to eat. Everything we eat was alive at some point. So there's a point to be made there, I guess. But how that necessarily relates to the gods, I don't really see. I don't really get the broader point. If the only thing I can really think is that maybe what he's trying to say is that we know that certain types of killing are wrong because of what's in the myths, I guess, that we have to just look to the myths and figure out from there if what the gods say about certain types of killing is good or bad. It's really all I can kind of figure out. But again, we end up getting into this same problem that was in the Euthyphro, which is that which gods are we talking about? If we're going off of myth, then, well, which gods and which type of permitted action is fine. It depends on what god we're talking about here, and there's a variation of different things that are permissible to the gods in the myths. This ends up being the exact problem that Euthyphro tries to bring up, where he says, well, Zeus did a bunch of awful things to his father, so it's okay for me to do this to my father. Yet, if we looked at another god, like, say, Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and home, or Juno, who's the goddess of marriage, she might not agree with that at all. They would look at it completely differently. So we end up in this same kind of conflict that we saw in the Euthyphro Dilemma. But overall, I'm not even really sure what his overall point is here.
The gods are the arbiters of what is holy and what is goodness. Goodness is not above the gods, because if we could say that good is above the gods and the good is bound by the laws of logic, that would mean that the laws of logic are above the one. And you could keep doing this ad infinitum.
You really can't do it ad infinitum. And that's the whole point of Platonic metaphysics, is to actually find that terminal point so that it isn't just turtles all the way down. That's the whole point, is that we get to the one and we say, no, the buck stops at the one. That's the ultimate good right there. Right? And all things are turned towards that ultimate good. So it's the exact opposite than what he's saying. It's not this just infinite regress. The entire reason that you have a first principle in philosophy is to prevent the idea of infinite regress. If we take the idea that he has about pluralism, that there is no ultimate unity, that it's all just, everything's just a plurality of things. He mentioned this in one of the earlier videos. That actually leads to an infinite regress, because you end up in this sort of eternal steady state where there's no single first cause for all things. There's just these myriad causes that go back into infinity, right? That's infinite regress. That's ad infinitum. But what he's talking about here is just really a straw man.
The buck stops with the gods, and that's what paganism is all about. And to end this, because this goes back to the original. Why was Socrates executed? He was executed for two reasons. Number one, for corrupting the youth. And number two, impiety toward the gods, or to put it in Plato's own words, believing in gods of his own invention rather than those uh, accepted by the state.
Here it's good to just point out that Socrates' trial was considered a farce afterwards. Nobody looked back at Socrates' trial and was like, we did good work there. Even the people who accused Socrates and were responsible for getting him executed, they didn't fare well afterwards. All of Athens turned on them. One of them was banished from Athens forever, and I think the other one was murdered. So it wasn't good what happened to them afterwards. The entire city and really all of the ancient world looked at the death of Socrates as being a tragedy and a huge miscarriage of justice. So it's weird to kind of bring up the accusations that were drawn against him because they largely were just flimsy nonsense accusations that didn't hold up in the ancient world anyways. Everybody always looked at it as a farce kind of trial. And even in this whole idea that he was making up gods, you know, the god that he was really talking or that they were mentioning was this idea of his Agathodiamon, this sort of guardian angel that he listened to. That was the one that they really accused him of making up. But everything else in the philosophy was all part of traditional religion and really an exposition of traditional religion and somebody trying deeply to understand who and what the gods really are.
And the best way to point this out is philosophy itself. What is philosophy? Philosophia, the love of Sophia. What is Sophia? The made up Platonic goddess of wisdom, which doesn't appear in classical Greek legend, but it does appear in Platonism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism.
I have no idea what he's talking about. I've been studying Platonism for years. No one talks about Sophia as a goddess. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be a goddess called Sophia, just in the sense that very often virtues would be turned into gods or goddesses. It'd be very common. You know, you have Justitia, who is the goddess of justice. Prudentia is the goddess of prudence. You know, you have the kind of cardinal virtues extolled as sort of angelic or godly figures, and it's not uncommon that wisdom would be there too, seen as a goddess. But to try to say that this is some like Platonic invention and that's really what they're mad at Socrates about, that worshiping some goddess named Sophia, I don't know where he's getting that from. There is a Gnostic goddess called Sophia that is more of the supreme. If you read the Pistis Sophia, which is part of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, there's some stuff like that in there. But again, we're not Gnostics. And so I don't really know what the criticism is. It just seems completely out of left field.
There was a goddess of wisdom in ancient Greece. You may have heard of her. Her name is Athena. You know, like what Athens is founded as.
Yeah, and she's broadly considered to be the patron goddess of philosophers. So I don't really know what you mean there either. It's like Platonists have venerated Athena, Minerva since the very beginning, and for good reason, because she's closely tied to the concept of philosophy, and Athens itself is closely tied to the birth of philosophy. So all that makes perfect sense. And at no point were the Platonists rejecting Athena, Minerva for some other goddess named Sophia and making that one up. Like, that's not something that happened. So I don't even know what any of this is about.
So, yes, they did make up new gods of their own invention because they were rebelling against true tradition. They wanted to censor it, destroy it, and that's what they did. So pagan revival means necessarily the abolition of Platonism from its grasp.
Okay, that's pretty much the end of his whole argument. So that last part goes to this whole idea that I need to have a broader video about this axial age idea that they have, that there's this pre-axial religion that's the one true faith, and that all axial religions are some awful degradation that revolutionized the ancient world and tore down all the ancient structures. The reality is that's just not what happened. When you really look at the ancient world, philosophy grew out of the earlier traditions. When you look at the pre-axial ideas, you see the early stages of theology. You see proto-theology in what they're talking about. You see them trying to understand the gods and trying to come to grips with what they are and thinking about those types of ideas. You see that going all the way back to Orpheus, who's one of these pre-axial characters, who lived earlier than 1000 BC. And he's talking about theology. He's literally called the theologian by a lot of ancient people. He's older than Homer, and he is the root of Platonism all the way back before Homer. And so to act like these ideas weren't around, or to act like they just sprung up when Plato brought them up, is absurd and just doesn't have anything to do with the actual history. I get it behooves them to draw this hard line and say there was this line in the sand where Plato showed up and he's this crazy revolutionary who wanted to destroy ancient religion. But the reality of history is that's not how it went down. This was a slow progression from the, whatever you want to call, pre-axial times into the axial age. And this was a sort of revolution, if you want to call it that, but really a new way of thinking about things that came about during the axial age, born out of this pre-axial tradition. It's a continuation of one to the next. It's not a revolution in the sense of completely upending everything that came before it. And that's exactly what you see in the Platonists. They didn't upend everything that came before it. They wanted to offer another perspective on things. And that perspective isn't one that's made up. It's one that comes from asking questions. And if you actually read the dialogues of Plato, that's what you'll see again and again, is Plato is asking questions. He's asking, what are the gods? In the Euthyphro dialogue, he's asking, well, what is piety? There's these people like Euthyphro around me who claim to know what piety is, so much so that they're confident enough in their sense of piety to accuse their fathers of murder. Well, let's ask them what's going on. And all he does is ask him questions. And when he does, it becomes very clear that people like Euthyphro don't actually know what piety is. They can't define it. They can't give a solid definition for it, because they don't really know. And this is the case with every one of these Platonic dialogues, more or less. Socrates is asking you, what is love? What does that actually mean? What are the gods? How should we understand them? Should we understand them in the way that the poets have presented them, or are they something else? And just rationally working out these ideas. And, the axial age is full of people asking those kind of questions, like, what are the gods? And what is good? What is bad? Where does everything come from? And this ends up getting to the crux of what my problem is with a lot of these, if you want to call them pre-axial pagans, or who are trying to support that kind of idea, or Nietzschean pagans, I think is another good term for them, is they're trying to bring humanity, or at least the movement of pagans, back into this pre-axial worldview, which to them means no more thinking, that you can't think anymore. There's no more asking questions about the gods. You're just supposed to accept that Homer is literally the Bible. He's the Bible of paganism, or the Eddas, or whatever poetry they can find that's the oldest, except for Orpheus, because of course they don't like Orpheus, because he's basically the root of Platonism, even though he's older than all of these other things. Never mind that part. They want Homer, and they want the Eddas, and they want these particular things to be taken as the holy gospel of paganism that we can never, ever contradict or say anything against. Or we can't even question them. We can't even wonder, I wonder what that means. Nope. There's no thinking going on in their worldview. You just have to accept it. It's history. Take it literally. If you don't take it literally, that means you're not taking it seriously. And all of this is just absurd. Like, we're going to ask questions. The axial age is one of those things that we've moved through. And at this point, we all think of religion in a more axial way. And frankly, even what they're doing is influenced by this axial age. They're looking at the traditional religions that they've been given. They're looking at Christianity and the state of the West, and they're asking questions. They're asking, why is it this way? And trying to come to some understanding of what the good is in their minds. They're doing the same thing. They just don't like the conclusions that some other people have drawn. But even when they get to the point of criticizing Platonism, as we've seen throughout all these videos we've done 5 hours on this now, when you look at all of them, their arguments are terrible. Like these are straw man arguments at best. And very few of their points have been substantive points. And I'm all about substantive criticisms of Platonism. There are really good, solid problems that they have with them. I think even this axial age stuff, if they really want to hash that out, I'm interested to have the conversation with them on the axial age specifically and what their ideas of it is and how they see it playing out and how they just view pre-axial paganism versus axial religion. So I'm good to have that conversation, but it needs to be substantive. And it's good for us to take a look at these arguments that they've put forward and throw out the ones that are garbage, which is unfortunately the vast majority of them. So overall, it's been fun doing the critique of this. And I think the guy who was in this did a really good job of trying to keep his ground on all of this. And there's a lot of things that got thrown at him. And I think the thing as Platonists that we have to look at is we need to be prepared for this kind of stuff. We need to be prepared that people are going to bring up these arguments about the Republic and we can refute those. And they're actually pretty easy to refute once we know the points to point to for it. We know that people are going to try to say that we're monists, and we've got a lot of great evidence to throw at them to say, no, we're not monists. Not least of which is us just saying to their face, we're not monists. People are also going to call us dualists, and we have to be able to refute that kind of dualism. And they're going to bring up other dialogues like the Euthyphro and other odds and ends. And we need to know how to defend against those things, because when we do, we get ourselves to a point where we can get to the actual substantive arguments. And when we do get to those substantive arguments, I think we need to do a lot of what Socrates is doing. At this end part here, when he's talking about the Euthyphro, I just realized what a great opportunity that would have been. It's a shame it was the last thing said, because it would have been great to be able to respond with the questions that Socrates asks Euthyphro in the Euthyphro. If he had asked those questions about the gods, we probably would have seen that the pagan revivalist guy falls into the same illogical traps and the logical fallacies, the circular reasoning that Euthyphro does. And that kind of philosophical midwifery, I think, is what could really lead us to being educational in these kind of debates and actually doing some real philosophy while we're having them, instead of just kind of arguing over these logical fallacies. So what I see a lot in these debates where it's like paganism versus Platonism, there is a lot of like Platonism on the back foot. And I think I understand partly why. And part of it is that Platonism is such a humongous tradition. There's so much to understand. If somebody wants to pull out some quote from Plotinus and say, oh, well, what about this? It's like, well, Plotinus is huge. The Aeneids are huge. And unless you've read all of them or really, really familiar with each and every part, the likelihood you're going to know that exact particular line and what it's referencing is tough. I mean, even Plato is humongous. I got it back here. It's reading the complete works of Plato is a feat for anybody. And then being able to pick out particular things and know how to defend them is tough to do. The one way I put it is like, we have a wide attack surface as Platonists. There's a ton of literature out there that's Platonic in nature. And so they have a lot to pick from. And these guys, unfortunately, whatever you want to call them, pre-axial pagans, they don't have a lot of attack surface because they don't really have much to go on. And they're kind of constantly in this level of critique, of always just critique, attack. They can be a bit relentless. But what we need to start doing is like what Socrates was doing in the Euthyphro, and start asking the right questions back to them. Force these people to define their position. We have to be able to do that. And throughout all of this debate, that's something that I really didn't get. I didn't get a strong sense of what pagan revivalism guys' actual beliefs are. What does he actually believe about the gods? He says some platitudes along the way, but nothing even closely approaching like a coherent philosophical worldview of what the gods are. And frankly, I don't think he has one. And I think if you started poking and prodding and asking those kind of Socratic questions, just like many of Socrates' interlocutors, I think you'd find that his arguments fall apart. So I think that's it for now. But this has been fun, and we're going to keep doing more of these. If you guys think of any other ones, or if you find any other videos like this out there and you want me to respond to them, please send them my way on YouTube or on X. Happy to take a look at them and, offer up my commentary on those. So thanks. Have a good night, guys.